Welcome to the Three Count Library. Today we'll be discussing The Eighth Wonder of the World by Bertrand, Hebert, and Pat Laprade. It is the definitive book on Andre the Giant. This book is tremendous. It is one of my favorite books ever. It's one of my favorite biographies that I've ever read. It is over 800 pages, but it dispels a lot of the small myths of Andre's career, some of which we will not be getting into because this book is entirely too big. And looking at my summary and how I was able to break it down, we're going to look at, as usual, with the library, we pick 3 topics usually. This one we will pick 4. We're going to skip Andre's childhood, but we will be talking about Andre in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. Of course, Andre the Giant died in 1993, so we might as well mix in the 90s to his career. Understand, this is going to be, despite the fact that's probably going to seem like a long video, this is actually just the tip of the iceberg on some of these things of the stories that are in this book. It's going to basically give you a timeline of Andre's career from when he started to when he ultimately was retired and in his ultimate death. That's going to be the timeline of this video. So this book was tremendous. Pat Laprade is a great historian. I think he works out of Montreal. If you look him up on Twitter, he speaks French. He wrote the Sisterhood of the Square Circle, which is a book on women's wrestling that I really enjoyed as well. He also wrote Mad Dogs, Midgets, and Screwjobs, a book on Montreal pro wrestling, the history of pro wrestling in Montreal. Great book as well, especially if you want to learn more about Andre's career and Hogan. But you also want to learn about the Vachons, the Rougeaus, Dino Bravo, the murder, all that kind of stuff. He's an excellent historian. So I'm not surprised at all that he was involved with this book and that it was actually very good. So please go out and buy this book. I, again, made the mistake of getting the ebook and not getting an actual physical copy. I want to rectify that one day. But these books are tremendous. You should go read them if you can find them. But for just to make sure that we start on a good note, we should talk about Andre in terms of where he was born, his birthday, and all this kind of stuff. So Andre René Roussimoff was born May 19th, 1946 in France. His parents are Boris Roussimoff-Stoff, who is Bulgarian of descent. He moved to France in the early 1940s, where he met Marianne Mazurek, who is French and Polish. They had 2 children before Andre. So Andre was the 3rd child. He was 13 pounds when he was born. But this was the 1940s. Nobody really knew anything was wrong with it. He was just a big baby. And then he just grew up to be a big kid. And that was basically the story, is that everybody knew Andre was big, but they didn't really think of him as being freakishly large. And because most people, like Andre, they grow up to be very big. But when Andre got big and thick, that's really when the things changed. But Andre was a bit of a beanpole when he finally got started. So we got to get started in Andre in the 1960s. In the mid-60s, around 1965, Andre the Giant meets Robert Lejat, a former professional wrestler turned promoter in France. Lejat, of course, was enamored with the size of Andre and hired a man named Michel Saulnier to train him. Andre was renamed Jean Ferret, and he was trained in Pigalle, which is a town in France that was, at the time, had plenty of unsavory types. So there was a lot of bars, clubs, whorehouses, and things like that. He made his professional wrestling debut in Rouen, northwest of Paris, on January 25, 1966. He wrestled Ted Lamar. And he began to wrestle all over France, eventually winning the heavyweight title. And he also did a couple of small movies while he was in France. So his success came pretty fast. Of course it did. I mean, look at the size of this guy. In the 1960s, he was, like the Elephant Man. So on February 11th, 1966, Andre had some televised matches for the first time. February 13th, he made his debut in Paris, defeating Yves Armour. In 1967, Andre began his acting debut with a movie called The Chinese Puzzle, The Judoka in Hell. It shows Andre doing a fight scene where he's doing karate. It's similar in scope to what we would see with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Bruce Lee in the 70s. It was kind of around that time. So it was a very similar scene where Andre, a young Andre, is in a fight scene, and it's very cool. So it was very limited, but it made him pretty famous. So 3 weeks before the movie's release is when he won the French heavyweight title over Franz von Byton. In 1969, Andre moved to England, or he toured England for the first time, beginning in Paisley, Scotland, and defeating a man named Wild Angus. He also wrestled Jim Huxley, and these matches were taped for TV, and these was his first televised matches in England. Jim Huxley is a very interesting man because his son is Rollerball Rocco. If you've ever don't know who Rollerball Rocco is, he was the original Black Tiger in Japan. So this is pretty cool for Andre. He got to wrestle Black Tiger's dad. June 7th, 1969, Andre suffers his first singles loss to Kendo Nagasaki by technical knockout in Hanley, England, Victoria Hall. Kendo Nagasaki was a local hero who was enjoying a bit of an undefeated streak and was a huge star. His real name was Peter Thornley. He was a white man who became a really big celebrity in the UK wrestling scene. And he won all the rematches too, so Andre the Giant never beat this guy. Andre wasn't a draw in England. The book kind of suggests that maybe he lost too soon, and the aura of invincibility that is needed for a giant to work was destroyed. But he did work mostly main events. In his December tour of England, Andre lost his last 8 matches, 5 by disqualification, 2 draws, and an actual clean loss. But he was making about 25 to 30 pounds a show, plus travel and lodging, doing 6 shows a week, 52 weeks a year. So he was making some pretty good cash around this time as well. He actually started to learn English because this was his first foray outside of France. Tony St. Clair and a lot of the French English bilingual wrestlers were teaching Andre English, so he was kind of learning in the beginning. 1969, Andre wrestled in South Africa as Andre Rousimov, but he was very unhappy there due to the amount of violence in South Africa at the time. He said he would never wrestle there again. His last match in England was December the 17th, a tag match with Gargantua versus Davies and Wall, and it was a loss. And Andre wouldn't work in England again for nearly 20 years. Andre's run in England ended up being really bad, considering that pretty much everywhere he went, the guys wanted to beat the giant. And that was kind of the story of Andre's career. You know, you look at him, he's a giant dude. You figure, hey, you draw a house, maybe we can beat him. And who cares about his career? It's all about mine. And the book talks about that, Kendo Nagasaki being a guy who didn't really care so much about the business as much as he cared about his own career. And that would kind of be the story of Andre dealing with people in the early part of his career. Is everybody want to beat him. Everybody wants to be the guy to beat the giant. Nobody really wants to be the guy that puts the giant over, do they? So 1969 is where he begins his trips to Japan. So in 1969, he goes to Japan for International Wrestling Enterprise, which is the second biggest wrestling promotion in Japan at the time. It was run by Isao Yoshihara, a wrestler and president of the company. And he filled in for a man named Roger Delaporte, teaming with Ivan Strogoff. And even though they lost to the Japanese contingent of this tournament or whatever, he really impressed the Japanese wrestlers and the promoters. And what they were really impressed with was the fact that he was larger than Giant Baba and more agile and in some ways faster. And if I remember correctly, he might have even been younger than Baba. So you get this young guy and he's hot. He comes over, he looks good, big. Everybody wants to get their hands on him. So this takes us to Andre in the 1970s. Andre's official debut for IWE International Wrestling Enterprise was January the 3rd, 1970, and they changed his name to Monster Rousimov, which was a play on the popularity of Godzilla movies at the time. Even created an origin story of Andre that a wrestler named Enrique Edo, who is Spanish, found Andre working as a lumberjack in the Pyrenees, which is a mountain range that splits Spain and France. And the story goes that this Enrique Edo found Andre as a lumberjack and asked him to become a wrestler? And Andre said yes. So Monster Rusimov, which sounds awesome. It sounds fantastic. But as the book says, Yoshihara was focused on getting his own talent over. So Andre lost a lot, but at least he was on television. And in Japan, he actually picked up one of his very bad habits, which is drinking. When he was a teenager and in his early part of his career, he wasn't much of a drinker. But in his later years, Andre would drink and bemoan his condition. Because he was beginning to find out that, his body was not the same as everyone else's. And different life became very difficult. Around this time, Andre had been traveling for about 5 to 6 years. So around this time, he was starting to notice that hotels could not accommodate him. He could barely fit into cars. In some places, there would be no beds for him. Again, this guy is very tall. He's not big yet. He's not as big as he would be yet. But life is very difficult for a guy his size and traveling. And in Japan is where he first really it starts to bother him. Because, there's no place for him. And he actually expressed a belief that he would die young in Japan. That he was actually fearing the fact that he would die young. And in Japan, it was also where he was actually diagnosed with acromegaly. So a short kind of description of acromegaly is it's a tumor in a particular part of your brain that overproduces certain compounds and proteins that makes certain parts of your body larger. So for Andre, it made his hands really big, his feet, and his head very big. So when you see pictures of old Andre, he has very big, he's a beanpole as far as being just tall and lanky. But if you was like to draw a stick figure with big hands and a big head, that would be how Andre was when he was younger. So he hadn't quite filled in yet. But he didn't want to have the tumor operated on because at the time, there was no guarantee. Other wrestlers in later years would have the tumor either removed or operated on in order to stop their growth. The Great Khali was one of them. The Big Show, of course, is another one. Both of those guys have acromegaly as well. The book actually went into a lot of detail about acromegaly, which is really fun. So to learn about Andre's condition. And they're saying, hey, these guys who had the surgery, it was able to save their lives. The Great Khali, they said a lot of these guys who die from acromegaly, they die in their 40s, like Andre did. But the Great Khali, for instance, had the surgery at around late 30s, like 39. So he got really close to reaching the red zone for his body falling apart. But Andre, of course, did not want to have any type of experimental surgeries to stop his growth. So he started just continuously growing. And so he started excessively eating and drinking, which led to his weight gain. And the weight gain is what made him Andre as we know him, the guy who was slammed by Hulk Hogan and all that kind of stuff. This is kind of where it begins in the early 70s in Japan. So Japan also, not just Japan though, but he also worked in other places. Adnan Al-Kaisi, who you know as General Adnan from the Hulk Hogan angle, is an Iraqi pro wrestler. He promoted matches in Iraq, and he brought in Andre to wrestle him on January 6, 1971. This was, of course, during the Saddam Hussein era of Iraq. And Saddam Hussein liked pro wrestling, according to the book, but didn't know that it was a work, and really pressured Adnan Al-Kaisi to win. And in some cases, people believed, or Adnan Al-Kaisi believed that if he had actually lost, they would have shot Andre. Not killed him. They would have killed Andre. So, at Al-Shabaab Stadium for a national holiday show, the match was absolutely sold out. And Adnan Al-Kaisi won 2 falls straight. And victory shots were fired in the air because this is a military holiday. And so they started shooting celebratory shots in the air. And Andre was so afraid. He scurried out of the ring and hid under it. So the shooting scared him so much that he hid under the ring. They didn't want to let him leave country, though. So Adnan Al-Kaisi gave him $10,000 for a rematch. And of course, he took it. I mean, why wouldn't he take it? Even though these guys kind of scared him with all these with all these guns and everything. It's $10,000, so he took it. Interesting thing, on March 31st, 1971, Andre began using the Tombstone Power Driver as a finish. That's very cool. That's nothing special about that. I just think that it's very cool that Undertaker was considered a lot for a long time to be sort of the modern Andre, and his finish is the same finish Andre used. So June 1st, 1971, Andre comes to North America for the first time. He begins wrestling in Montreal. Frank Valois, he had met Andre in France and suggested him to the Vachons, who and Edouard Carpentier recruited Andre to Grand Prix. Andre wrestled his last match in France on May 30th, 1971. So approximately the day before he wrestled in France. So Montreal is in Quebec, Canada, is a mostly French-speaking audience, and they, of course, loved the French giant. Andre was billed from the French Alps and was said to be 7'4" height, and that is tremendous amount of height. Now, they did go into quote-unquote trying to debunk how tall Andre was. I am a person who I support the mythology. I don't support the reality. The reality is cool, but it's less cool than the mythology. If the mythology is that Andre the Giant is 7'4", 600 pounds, then guess what? Andre the Giant is 7'4", 600 pounds, because wrestling is a work. I don't care how tall he really was. But for people who do care about how tall Andre the Giant really was, that he was measured at death, and it was found to be 6'10", but he had lost about 2 inches in height due to osteoporosis. Because Andre wasn't always the tallest wrestler in the world, even though he was billed as the Giant, Senior would protect Andre's image by telling him he could not and should not ever meet or take pictures with people who are legit taller than he is. They tell a story in the book of Andre wanting to meet Wilt Chamberlain, or Wilt Chamberlain wanted to meet Andre. I don't know how I remember that went, but they made sure that the two never met, because if they did meet, people would be able to see that Wilt Chamberlain or whomever was as tall as Andre or taller, and that would destroy his mystique and, of course, destroy his ability to draw. So that's a smart little nugget there that everybody dropped in to protect Andre and his character and everything. That was pretty cool. Montreal is the first place to book Andre as a giant. He is wrestling 2 men at once. The booking of giants as being guys who can fight 2 men or more at once. They actually tell the mythology of that as well, that it begins with Martin the Blimp Levy. During the 1930s and 40s, the Blimp was a 500-pound man, and he worked as an attraction. And he would often fight multiple men at once. So that idea was brought to Montreal by Paul Vachon, the adoptive father of Luna Vachon. So if you remember that from the Dark Side of the Ring, that ought to be pretty cool. So Paul Vachon would also teach Andre the most important thing. Don't let anyone slam you or take you off of your feet. He also was the first guy to ban Andre from doing drop kicks. Now, you may have seen clips maybe posted online of Andre doing actual wrestling stuff. He used to be able to do drop kicks. He used to do forward flips. He was a very agile guy when he was younger. But Paul Vachon didn't want him doing any of that stuff. He said, don't do it. Don't destroy your mystique. Protect yourself. He also booked him a lot in battle royals. And Andre's debut coincided very well with Grand Prix Wrestling's TV debut, considering they were in a turf war with the Rougeau organization. This was a pretty big deal for them. So Andre lost his first match in Montreal to the Hollywood Blondes, the original Hollywood Blondes. And when a third man interfered. So it wasn't a clean victory. And plus only 400 people, and there was no television or anything like that. So nobody actually saw him lose his first match in Montreal. He had his first wrestling match in the United States for the American Wrestling Association. Paul Vachon and the Vachon family were close with Vern Gagne. Vern has saw Andre in Japan and said that Andre should make money as a boxer and not as a wrestler. And so the Minneapolis Boxing Club, which was owned by Wally Carbo and Vern Gagne, who the same owners of the AWA, wanted to sign Andre to do boxing matches. But Andre wasn't interested in that stuff, because why would he be? And what the hell was wrong with Verne Gagne? This was around the time Andre started calling everybody boss. And because Andre was meeting new people all the time. And so he was constantly under pressure to remember names. So what he would do, he just called people boss. Whatever you say, boss. It became the same thing with Hogan and Brother, you know. So you don't have to remember names if you just find a pet name for everybody. So boss was Andre's. Hogan would call everybody brother. And in July the 24th, 1971, Andre Roussimoff wrestled for the American Wrestling Association. A week later, they changed his name to Jean Ferret, which is the same name he would use in, I believe, in Montreal as well. In 1971, Detroit, Wilbur Sniper and Dick the Bruiser start running opposition in Detroit against the Sheik. Sheik Edward Farhat, the uncle of Sabu. The Bruiser was friendly with the Vachons as well. He billed Andre as the Polish Giant. Now, the reason he billed Andre as the Polish Giant is because not only because Andre's mother is Polish, but because Detroit at that time had a very high Polish population, and they still do, by the way. I live in Detroit. When Andre went back to Minneapolis, he was known as Andre the Giant Frenchman. Back in Montreal, they started booking Andre against Don Leo Jonathan in a match that was called the Battle of the Behemoths. This was the match that actually helped them overtake All-Star Wrestling, which is the Rougeau faction. The match took place on May 31st, 1972, which was approximately a year after Andre's debut. It drew 16,164 people, and Andre Giant lost by disqualification because he would not stop strangling Don Leo Jonathan. They had a pretty good run up there, too. On September the 1st, 1972, the Chicago Wrestling Club, which was owned by Verne Gagne, Wilbur Snyder, and Dick the Bruiser, held a show at Soldier Field. This is where Dick the Bruiser came up with the name Andre the Giant. I know part of the mythology is Vince Sr. came up with Andre the Giant. But it was actually Dick the Bruiser. Dick the Bruiser came up with Andre the Giant because he was told that Andre's wrestling name was Jean Ferret. And in English, it sounds like John Ferry. And he refuses to book a big guy named Ferry. So he just called him Andre the Giant. Simple and to the point, and as most genius tends to be, the simpler a thing is, usually the better it is. So a promoter named Abe Ford is attempting to sell the Boston and New England territories to Grand Prix. This is the Vachons. Paul Vachon was interested, and Abe Ford said, hey, give me $100,000. It turns out that Boston and New England was not owned by Abe Ford at all, but was owned by Vince McMahon Sr. So the Vachons was trying to buy the McMahon territory without them even knowing it. Vince called the Vachons in, and they sat down and had a little bit of a talk. And to clear up this misunderstanding, and they suggested that Andre go work for Vince McMahon Sr. And the Vachons thought that Andre was better off in New York, where he could wrestle on a bigger platform. This is probably some of the most heartwarming, comforting things that I've ever read in a wrestling book, is how Paul Vachon, even to this day, feels that even though he was, Andre was a top star in their territory, they could not take care of him. They said, look, you got this huge guy. He's a big draw for us. We're in the middle of a war, but we can't take care of this guy. He needs a bigger platform. And so they sent him to Vince McMahon Sr. And I thought that was very cool. So Andre makes his WWF debut on March the 24th, 1973 in a handicap match. He makes his Madison Square Garden debut on March the 31st, the very next week. This is where Vince McMahon Sr. starts making the mythology of Andre, saying that Andre was bigger than Gorilla Monsoon, Primo Carnera, that he was taller than Wilt Chamberlain and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and that he was undefeated and had never been beaten by anyone. As a thank you for the Vachons, when he booked Andre, often he would book other members of the Grand Prix wrestling circuit, so the Vachons as well, and some of the other guys, when Andre was used as well. Around this time, Frank Valois was brought in as the travel partner of Andre, and also Andre's English wasn't very good, so Frank Valois was there for that too. And of course, this culminates with Vincent J. McMahon creating a management deal with Andre, where he became Andre's official manager. So you would have to go through him to get Andre. The Vachons got nothing out of this deal and didn't want anything out of the deal. So it was a bit of a later in the book they discussed this as it was not on paper, that it was a sort of handshake deal between Andre, Vince Sr., and the Vachons. That, Andre would sign with Vince as an exclusive talent. Vachons would not get any money for Andre, but they could use Andre without being charged. So he would waive his fee if they wanted to use Andre. That was the only thing they got out of the deal. And of course, some of their guys got extra bookings. If Andre was booked, then they got to book too. From there, Vince McMahon started booking Andre similar to how the NWA would book their world champion, with his percentage attached, essentially. So if you wanted to use Andre, you had to contact Vince McMahon, say, hey, I want Andre on the 17th of January. He would see if he's using Andre or if anybody else wants him. He would tell you the price. Then he would ship Andre out there and to make your show. This was, of course, a genius plan so that Andre could make extra cash and to keep Andre fresh in his territory. Because exclusivity means Andre, of course, is going to work the big towns, the Philadelphias and the New Yorks. But, even though it's a territory and it's a big territory, it's still a territory and they can't overexpose Andre. So this kept Andre fresh. He got to continue to travel, which he liked doing, despite the fact that it was very uncomfortable for him. But he often would, use this to make extra cash or to bring in other guys that he wanted. It would be a talent trade. So Andre's time as a full-time talent in Montreal was essentially over, at this point. In 1974, Vincent J. McMahon dubs Andre the eighth wonder of the world. Brazil and Pampero Firpo had also gone by eighth wonder of the world at one point, but it kind of stuck with Andre. And when people hear the eighth wonder of the world, typically they think Andre the Giant. So Vincent J. McMahon also banned Andre from doing drop kicks and other type of agile moves to not really expose his character or expose the business. Around this time, too, Andre was shipped back to Japan, this time to work for Antonio Inoki and to help build New Japan Pro Wrestling. The WWF and New Japan had a long-running relationship around this time. There's a interesting connection between Vince McMahon and Antonio Inoki. And Vince Sr. accompanied Andre to Japan, which was Vince Sr.'s very first trip to Japan. He had never been to Japan before until he went over there with Andre. So this was beneficial for New Japan because Baba, who ran All Japan, had a partnership with the NWA. So it was the two biggest wrestling promotions in Japan and the two biggest wrestling promotions in the United States, and they were teaming up to sort of bump heads. Andre also wrestled in Brazil. He wrestled Inoki in Brazil, and they drew 21,000 fans. Inoki was discovered in Brazil, by the way, by Ricky Dozan. So that's why he was such a big star there. So Andre the Giant goes on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson for the first time, but Johnny Carson was not there. There was a guest host. His name was Joey Bishop. Later in 1974, Andre also went on his first trip to Australia. So by the end of that year, Andre was making $400,000 and was the highest paid pro wrestler in the world. On January 17th, 1975, Andre wins the Los Angeles Battle Royal. Battle Royal was inspired by Roy Shire's Cow Palace Battle Royal, an annual event. It was a huge annual draw. I mention this because this is the precursor to the Royal Rumble. Roy Shire's Battle Royal in the Cow Palace, which is a yearly event, was the biggest draw out west. And Pat Patterson actually worked out west quite a bit. He started his career in San Francisco. So he worked for Roy Shire, and he kind of brought that concept of a yearly Battle Royal to the WWF, and this was the creation of the Royal Rumble. So it was a big draw, and Andre won this event twice. Around this same time, Andre is becoming a sort of a national phenomenon. And the boys and a lot of the fans are becoming obsessed with Andre, specifically with Andre's dick. And they start telling stories about, fans paying people to try to take pictures of Andre's dick. It is bizarre. It tells one story of when he was in Mid-South, when Andre was in Mid-South, Jim Ross was paid $100 by a woman and gave a camera to him and says, "Get a picture of Andre's dick." But Jim Ross was too scared to do it. This is absolutely insane that people were, but it's human nature. You see that he has a large head. You see that he has large hands. You see that he has large feet. So you kind of be like, well, what about his dick? I don't know. Around this time, also, Andre was supposedly offered a spot for the Washington Redskins. This was very fun. It was a whole ordeal that the Washington Redskins wanted to sign Andre the Giant to play football. Andre had no interest in football, and he never really tried out to play it. And then this is a very interesting thing. Andre didn't want to take the pay cut. He was paid more than any player in the NFL at the time. NFL contracts were different in the 1970s. But it turns out that this whole thing was just a ploy by Vince McMahon to drum up more interest in Andre. That he had friends with the Washington Redskins, and they were talking about this big we're going to sign Andre the Giant to play football for us. And Andre was never going to play football, so it was a gag that Vince Sr. and the Washington Redskins were playing on the media. They were basically just using the media to drum up more interest in Andre. He was never going to play football. Another thing that they did to drum up interest in Andre was send him out to do more movies. So Andre did a cameo on the $6 Million Man. He did a fight scene with Lee Majors as Bigfoot. This ended up being a very popular episode of the $6 Million Man. This show is before my time, so I've never actually seen it, but I've heard a lot about it. Andre, 1976. Andre battles Chuck Wepner on the same card as Antonio Inoki battled Muhammad Ali. The rules were that Chuck could do anything a boxer would normally do. So he relied a lot on the ropes, and that Chuck Wepner was not a good worker by any stretch of the imagination. So he botched pretty much everything. And he even botched the finish. The match only went 1 minute and 17 seconds, but was seen as a complete and total disaster. However, Andre did not stop, screwing around with boxers, because he did a boxing match in Puerto Rico against Gorilla Monsoon. Monsoon owned a piece of the Puerto Rican territory at the time. The two's boxing fight drew 18,000 people, and Andre won by knockout. It sounds like it was a lot of fun. Around this time, Bill Apter decided to make a big splash and cause some problems. So Bill Apter ran an article claiming that Jerry the King Lawler had defeated Andre the Giant by countout. This was a big ordeal because Andre was being billed as being undefeated. And here comes Bill Apter running articles that Andre had lost a match. This is when Andre was sent to Memphis. He wrestled Jerry Lawler. And it was all phony anyway. Andre actually won the match. But Memphis had sent select pictures to Bill Apter to post. And this was a whole thing about Jerry Lawler trying to get national headlines. So Vince McMahon was pissed at Bill Apter for not consulting with him first before he ran this story that kind of blew up Andre's mystique. And he was also pissed at Lawler and Jerry Jarrett for daring to beat Andre. And Jerry, the hilarious story in this thing is that not only did Jerry Jarrett, who was being bitched at by Vince McMahon Sr., not only did he defend the finish by saying, "I didn't know that countouts counted. Like, I thought we could win by countout. I didn't know we couldn't beat them by countout either." But it was false. Andre won the match. So he misremembered a match that he booked. But that goes to show, once again, a lot of these guys see Andre as a way of putting themselves over. This whole thing was about trying to get national attention on Jerry Lawler. They ran a fake story using Bill Apter, and Bill Apter and Jerry Lawler actually had a problem with each other after this. And it said that for a long time they really didn't even speak because he got Bill Apter so much heat in New York with this fake story. So that was pretty funny. They also take the time out in the book to talk about how many times Andre was slammed, and Andre had been getting slammed pretty much since the beginning, from the sounds of things. Andre had been slammed in Europe, in Japan, in Montreal, and in Chicago. But in 1978, Harley Race slammed Andre the Giant. This time there were actual pictures, and but Andre would pressure the photographers to drop them. Andre around this time was doing the Body Slam Challenge, where he would pay anybody $25,000 if they could body slam him. And since he didn't want his gimmick to end, he would always slide a couple of bucks to the photographers to lose the footage of him being slammed. The interesting thing about this is Harley Race believed that he was the first man to slam Andre the Giant, even though Andre had been slammed all the time prior to this. So he really wasn't. But a lot of this, of course, comes from the heat of WrestleMania 3, where, everybody says Andre lost for the first time and Andre was slammed for the first time. And none of that is true. But for the purpose of mythology, as I said, Harley Race didn't slam the Andre the Giant. He slammed a guy named Andre the Giant. So, in the late 70s, Ronnie Garvin actually pinned Andre the Giant. It was a 2-on-1 situation, and Andre still managed to lose. This was in Knoxville, Tennessee. Andre did a job for Ronnie Garvin. He and Andre were friends. Ronnie Garvin is actually from Montreal and was friends with Andre. So Andre did his friend a favor, worked a handicap match with a partner, and Ronnie Garvin beat him. So this was a big favor to a friend, but Andre says, look, the match cannot be taped, and there could be no pictures. So there were no pictures, there were no tapes, only that somebody recorded the finish that Andre the Giant lost a handicap match and was pinned with a partner. This, of course, was not approved by Vince McMahon Sr., and I'm pretty sure it didn't make him very happy either. In 1978, Andre faced Ernie Ladd in New Orleans on the undercard of an NWA show that featured Harley Race and Dusty Rhodes. The show drew 20,000 fans and had a $100,000 gates, which was the biggest in Louisiana at the time. He would wrestle Ernie Ladd again in New York City in Madison Square Garden. They drew $18,000. So on April the 30th, 1979, Andre's daughter was born, Robin Christensen. The mother was Jean Christensen, who worked as a valet manager photographer and was part of the ring crew. She was also a wrestler named Trixie Colt. The two met in 1974. They had an on-again, off-again relationship. Andre and Jean often had issues, and there was a belief that Andre, due to his size and sort of nature, was sterile. Yet, so he denied paternity of Robin Christensen for a long time. But it turns out that later that he would end up doing a paternity test, and it found out that she really was his daughter, and it's essentially his only child. Jean didn't want Robin to learn too much about the business, so they kept the business separate. And Robin and Andre didn't have much of a relationship, and most of his friends didn't even know she existed for a really long time. The nature of their relationship was that Andre essentially sent gifts and letters, but not much in the way of conversation. And there was a paternity suit filed against Andre in 1991. And Jean blamed Andre's entourage, all the people that were surrounding him, for the court battles and his denying the paternity and all this sort of stuff that had been going on. Around this time, she was about 13 or 14 at the time. So Andre was paying $750, and she wanted it up to $1,000, and it became $1,000 a month in 1991. And Robin was never a wrestling fan, and she didn't watch WrestleMania 3. She actually didn't watch it until it was on the internet. She didn't want to see her daddy getting beat up. So that's very sweet, but it was very sad, and there were parts of the book that really laid it on thick in terms of how he sort of, I don't want to use the word neglect, but there's no better word for it, his relationship with Robin. He enjoyed traveling and hanging out with the boys. He had no interest in being a father. He had no interest in bringing his daughter around the business. And in this book, they tell these stories of how close Andre was with other people's children, specifically with Stephanie McMahon. That he would take her out to dinner dates, and there's pictures with him and Stephanie sitting on his lap and all this sort of stuff. But he never took those pictures with his own daughter. He was very close with other people's kids, but never with his own. And that was a very interesting angle that the book went into. And I love that the book was a flaws and all look at Andre, and didn't run away from some of the things Andre did wrong, like not taking care of his kid. This brings us to Andre the Giant in the 1980s. This is probably the most favorite time for most people listening to this video. You will probably remember Andre in the 80s. So around this time, Frank Valois, who was Andre's handler and his traveling buddy, was replaced by Arnold Scotland. And because Frank Valois had turned about 50 years old and wanted to retire, it was too much for him to be traveling all the time. So English, and he didn't really need him to translate anymore either, because Andre's English had improved quite a bit around this time. So Valois, Andre, and others had bought into the Montreal territory, each one with a 20% share, and they created what was called the Valousac promotions. Va, meaning Valois, Rus is Andre Roussimoff, and Ac was the real name of Gino Brito. I don't remember what his real name is. I didn't write it down. Anyway, Andre was a silent partner. Capital Wrestling also gave Gino Brito money to invest in Valousac promotions in Canada. Patterson was often asked by Vince Sr. to watch over the Montreal territory for Andre. So Andre, as a silent partner, would never really be involved, but he would have Pat Patterson there sort of looking over to make sure that nothing goes awry and that Andre's money was used properly. But in any event, Vince Sr. was said to have given Andre essentially a blank check when he would go out. He could eat whatever he wanted, drink whatever he wanted, go to any hotel that he wanted, and Vince Sr. would just pay for it because that was his top guy. So he wanted to keep him happy. He didn't care what Andre spent. And there's a lot of stories about Andre running up incredible bills and Vince Sr. just saying, give him the money. Whatever it is, give it to him. And it not being that big of a deal, which is insane if you think about it, but it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. He was their top guy. So Hulk Hogan, we get into the Hulk Hogan stuff. So Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant meet in Binghamton, New York at a house show. Andre was the only person that was allowed to beat Hogan in the early days of Hogan's run in the WWF. They had their first match on April 26, 1979 in Pensacola, Florida. I think Hogan would have been in the business probably about 2 years around this time. I'm doing that off the top of my head. So Hogan broke into Montreal for Valousac, and he was an undefeated terror, squashing the 53-year-old former NWA World Heavyweight Champion Edouard Carpentier in 30 seconds on Bastille Day, which is a French national holiday, and Carpentier is French. So which was July the 14th. This was all was building up to a big match between Hogan and Andre, and they were both top 10 draws in 1980. Andre was 6th, Hogan was 8th. In May 1981, however, Andre would break his ankle and need surgery. There's a lot of stories of how Andre broke his ankle, and it turns out he just broke his ankle getting out of bed, which is, of course, the least sexy story of this whole ordeal. Of course, in kayfabe, they blamed it on Killer Khan, the giant Japanese guy, and that's a pretty fun thing that they just kind of went with it. Hey, we're gonna say that this guy broke your ankle. December 1981, the Sports Illustrated article comes out that spreads a lot of the mythology of Andre the Giant. This is where they sat down with Andre, and Andre spun them this yarn of all of these great things that had taken place, and how tall he was and all this kind of stuff. And a lot of misinformation that people believe about Andre comes from this particular article, this 1981 Sports Illustrated article. This book really operates kind of as a vaccine against this article, where you get a lot of the BS Andre stuff. So Valousac was going on swimmingly until Dino Bravo. So Dino Bravo was a top guy in Montreal. Didn't quite take kindly to Andre's popularity. He really hated that Andre made more money than he did, and that Andre wasn't as good as him. And because Andre was known as being sort of a gentle giant in real life, he really didn't like confrontations. He would really rather walk away from a problem than, be the big mean giant and destroy somebody, throw somebody through a wall or something like that. So due to the amount of, headbutting him and Dino Bravo was having, he just gave up, and he just sort of sold his shares in Valousac And it really kind of upset him that he was, I guess you want to say, forced out of that promotion. And even though he wasn't a co-owner, he continued to wrestle for them and continued to be a big draw. But December 26, 1983, against Blackjack Mulligan was his final match for Verusak, which was the company that he co-owned and co-founded. So him leaving Montreal, of course, weakened his relationship with Frank Valois. The two actually never spoke again. The schism between them was said to be about a, quote, betrayal, about Valois spreading gossip about Andre. And some people believe that Valois was stealing money from Andre and got caught. But the Valois family, of course, denies this, and Andre never discussed it. So nobody knows what the two guys who have been friends for years, and were traveling buddies for a long time, why they will all of a sudden just fall out and never speak to one another again. And people were completely and totally unsure about why that happened, but it never happened. 1983, Andre fused with Kamala in Mid-South. This was around the time Kamala felt that Andre had choked him unfairly and far too much. And he says that Andre didn't like him, and that he started carrying a pistol, a 22 caliber pistol, and later a pocket knife, just in case Andre got a little too rough with him. Andre, of course, allowed Kamala to slam him. I remember seeing this on Mid-South Wrestling TV. And he actually bladed to sell one of Kamala's attacks. So he kind of liked him enough to allow Kamala to slam him and to try to make some money with him. Kamala also claims that Andre called him the N-word after some miscommunications in a match. Andre would later apologize, and they would squash it about that. Andre would then help Kamala get into Madison Square Garden. And this was the second person that had sort of said Andre was a little loose with the N-word. Bad News Allen was also said that Andre would use the N-word all the time while he was in Japan. Around this time, they claimed that Andre was basically just drunk and using the word all the time. And that the Iron Sheik also claimed that Andre didn't like him and would sort of bully him and be very rough with him in matches. And that Andre liked to do ribs, which is, sometimes it was friendly ribs, like hitting people in the face with pies or doing some other stuff. But Iron Sheik claimed that Andre ripped his pants, like just grabbed his pants and ripped them off. Andre has big hands. He could do stuff like that. So there was, the book didn't run away from some of the things that Andre may have done wrong, like maybe dropping the N-bomb on Kamala or, using it around Bad News Allen. So this is a very interesting subject, of course, considering so many people have said this about Hulk Hogan and, the Ultimate Warrior and all these guys, and now kind of Andre too, and Ric Flair is another one where Teddy Long says that Ric Flair called him the N-word, and this kind of stuff floats around the industry. Is pretty much, you're not really a top star in wrestling until somebody says that you called somebody else the N-word, and I can't tell you whether it's true or not. But I can tell you for sure that if the other people allowed it, then they allowed it. If Kamala says it happened, and then he says, but we were cool afterwards, he apologized and, he was frustrated or whatever the case may be, and we got over it, then I don't see the problem, and I'm not going to make a big deal out of it. Same thing with Bad News Allen. If Bad News Allen is a legit judoka. If he was sit right there and Andre was calling people the N-word and he confronted him about it, and Andre said, look, I'm just kind of drunk, being stupid, sorry. And he was like, okay, well, as long as you apologize, dude, it's over, and then, it's kind of old stuff, but I'm glad that they mentioned it in the book and they didn't try to run away from it. Later in the 80s, there's a lot of stories of Andre being temperamental and, not liking guys, so of course there's stories of him not liking the Ultimate Warrior and him not liking Randy Savage, him not liking Jake Roberts, there's a lot of different things. And some of the mean ribs, like him ripping Iron Sheik's pants, or the mean rib where Roddy Piper had painted himself half black and Andre dumped out the solution, the paint thinner or whatever the case, to get that stuff off and replaced it with water. and kind of left Roddy Piper to try to figure out how to get this damn paint off of him. So sometimes there's, it goes to show that, he's a full human being. And I like that was the angle that the book took, is that in destroying the mythology of Andre, they also wanted to build up the man of Andre. So they want to talk about him, but they have to talk about him as a full human being and not as a cartoon character that everybody grew up with. And as a full human being, he has faults. He didn't raise his daughter like he should have. Maybe he used racial slurs. He did things that he probably shouldn't have. He drank too much. He ate too much. He didn't want to take care of his body. He had depression and all these other issues that he had. They're sort of bringing a warts and all thing to this book, and it's very enlightening. It's not about being judgmental. It's about being aware and saying to yourself, yo, we're talking about a guy here, like a real human being. So it's kind of like you're talking about George Washington. Like George Washington had slaves, just a matter of fact. It's not like a judgment thing that we're judging George Washington for having slaves. It's just a fact. If Andre the Giant used racial slurs, it's just a fact that he did. And this would have been in the 80s. So it wasn't like exactly like with George Washington having slaves. But it was just a thing about the times and how the people in the situation, how they handled it and what they did about it and what they had to say about it. And I found that to be very interesting. So around this time, 1983, of course, Vincent K. McMahon takes over the wrestling world, and Andre's appearances in Madison Square Garden, all of a sudden, they doubled. McMahon, the warlord of all wrestling, he actually ended the Andre on loan system. So Andre was no longer going to AWA or NWA promotions. He wasn't going to the AWA anyway due to pay disputes. But the saddest thing, I should say, is that Andre missed Vincent J. McMahon's funeral. That he was in Japan at the time. Vince McMahon Sr. died on May 27th. His funeral was May the 30th. And Andre wasn't there. So he never got to say goodbye to the guy who made him, millions and millions of dollars. But Andre was used as the tip of the spear. And I liked how they used that language in this book, that he was the featured act everywhere Vince wanted to break into. So with the exception of St. Louis, Chicago, Houston, and Toronto, when Andre was not available, Andre was usually the first act that Vince McMahon sent into a town when he was invading. We also talked about Andre's political power around this time. Andre the Giant was instrumental in bringing in the Fabulous Freebirds during their very, very, very short stint in the WWF. This would be Michael Hayes, Terry Gordy, and Buddy Roberts. So Michael Hayes, of course, notoriously has problems with alcohol. He shows up to a show drunk. Andre sees him, tells him that he's fired. Michael Hayes shoots back at Andre. You're not the boss. You can't fire us. And Andre was just kind of like, well, we'll see. We'll see what happens. And the Freebirds got their walking papers. And it wasn't until Michael Hayes came back as Doc Hendricks that he worked in the WWF again. So around this time, WrestleMania is becoming a phenomenon. And Andre liked the idea of Ken Patera and John Studd as opponents for him. So Andre had grown an afro, the short fro that you see him with all the time. It was a way of creating an illusion when it comes to his height, so he can take pictures with tall guys again and not feel like he's short. So he grew out his hair to make himself seem taller. And they wanted to do a big WrestleMania angle. So what they did is they had John Studd and Ken Patera cut his hair, something that had never been done before. And because this was two men, one of them is Big John Studd, who was huge, cut Andre's hair, it got Andre sympathy, which is something that rarely happens because it's very very hard to get sympathy for giants. So this led to the Battle of the Giants at Body Slam Challenge for $15,000 at WrestleMania. So around this time, going back to the political power angle, Andre didn't like Big John Studd. He felt like Big John Studd was sort of encroaching on his gimmick. Andre had started doing the gimmick of stepping over the top rope. You've seen Diesel do it. You've seen Undertaker do it. You've seen Kane do it. It was an Andre gimmick. And Big John Studd had started doing it. And Andre was kind of like, wait a minute, this guy's my gimmick is being big. This guy's gimmick is being big. I'm stepping over the top rope. He's stepping over the top rope. And he was kind of like, this guy's trying to take my spot. This guy's trying to, trying to get over on me. And he felt like John Studd was trying to take his spot, So he didn't really like John Studd. And John Studd says that he was a fan of Andre, and he just was imitating him because he liked him. He thought he was great. He's a representative as another big guy. But the story goes that Andre disliked John Studd so much and scared him so much that John Studd quit the business. That after the whole WrestleMania thing, I'm pretty sure this was a few years later, but it was a pretty wild story that Andre scared Big John Studd so much that he got the hell out of the whole business. Like that's crazy. So in the mid '80s, the Big Bear Little Bear scenario begins. This is where Tim White takes over for Arnold Scotland as Andre's handler. Arnold Scotland had turned 60 years old and he wanted to get off the road. Tim White was a vendor for the WWF, and he later became a road agent and a referee. Andre hated him initially because he didn't really know him. He was just kind of like a gopher that Vince and company decided to send with Andre. Unlike Scotland, who Andre kind of knew, Tim White was completely foreign to him. He didn't know this guy. So it took him a while to sort of warm up to Tim White, and Tim White is usually the source for a lot of really good Andre stories. So Andre has a issue, sort of a shoot fight with Akira Maeda in 1986 in New Japan. Of course, this is born out of Akira Maeda being one of these pro wrestling isn't true sports, mixed martial arts aficionados in Japan. All these shoot style guys that pop up every once in a while out of Japan who want to turn pro wrestling into a fight. So apparently, Akira Maeda and Andre the Giant got into a little bit of a issue in the ring where they both started to stop cooperating. Maeda kept trying to slam Andre until Andre took, and when that didn't work, he would do double leg takedowns to take Andre down. And the match ended up just being such a boondoggle that Antonio Inoki jumped in the ring and stopped it. The match was 26 minutes. 26 minutes of horror for Andre and dealing with this knucklehead, Akira Maeda. Around this time, Andre's last run in Japan, Vince McMahon ended the deal with New Japan around this time. So June 17th, 1986, Andre put over Antonio Inoki by submission. This will be Andre's first ever submission loss, and I'm pretty sure it was his only submission loss, maybe? I don't remember seeing that Andre had lost by submission to anyone else. But he really liked Antonio Inoki. Andre famously starred in The Princess Bride, which was his first role with actual words. And while he was away during The Princess Bride, they did an angle where Andre was suspended. This would lead to WrestleMania 3. As Andre turned heel just before the release of The Princess Bride, which they blamed as hurting the promotion for the movie because Andre had turned heel. The beginning of the storyline began November 29th, 1986, where the suspension was lifted, and we find out that Bobby the Brain Heenan, who was the one who got Andre suspended in the first place, is now the one who wants Andre's suspension lifted, and that the two of them have now formed an alliance. In February of 1987, it is confirmed that Bobby the Brain Heenan is the new manager for Andre the Giant. And we know all of this story for Andre up to WrestleMania 3, where Andre is going to be slammed and leg dropped by Hulk Hogan. But there's some nuggets in here that are still worth noting. There was a Saturday night main event taped on February the 21st. It aired March the 14th from Detroit, Michigan at Joe Louis Arena, where Hogan was in a battle royal with Andre the Giant, and Andre threw Hogan out. That match got an 11.6 rating. That match, a battle royal featuring Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant, got an 11.6 rating. 11.6. Of course, they go through the mythology of WrestleMania 3 about whether it was nearly 93,000 people or really 7,800. But it was still the biggest wrestling event of all time, considering it made $1.6 million in ticket sales, 45,000 closed circuit buys for a gate of 5.2 million, and it had 450,000 buys on pay-per-view. Andre was paid $750,000 plus $250,000 for doing the job. So he's paid $1 million for WrestleMania 3 alone. Hogan was paid $750,000. They didn't mention any bonuses, but I doubt the big brother walked away with just $750,000. Andre ended up having back surgery after WrestleMania 3. So he made a huge amount of money for just WrestleMania. That's pretty badass. 1988, things are starting to trend somewhat downward for Andre. He gets into a tiff with Dick Ebersol, who was not with NBC at the time. But Dick Ebersol is a consultant for the WWF. He's still helping produce these Saturday night main event shows where Andre won the WWF title. Andre was not happy with Dick Ebersol and the whole TV production team taking over the wrestling business. He was not a fan of that. He was, a territory wrestler. He didn't like this. They did this so Hogan could go off and feel no holds barred. Plus, Linda was pregnant with Brooke around the same time. So they took the title off Hogan so that he can go do the movie and so Linda could have the baby. But it was another little tiff here because Andre was mad that he was not asked to be in No Holds Barred, which I didn't really think of until I read this book, that Andre is not in No Holds Barred. And he said like a lot of his friends like Stan Hansen and Terry Funk are in this movie and he's not in it. And he had done movies for years. He had been doing movies for 20 years at this point. Off and on, of course. But he had been doing movies off and on for 20 years and he was not asked to be in this movie. And this comes up again when he is replaced at Survivor SummerSlam 89. He's replaced by Zeus, Tiny Lister. And he starts feeling like, this place doesn't really respect me anymore. That after the slam and the leg drop, they don't really need me anymore. But, they still, for the purpose of the narrative that I'm telling here, the narrative meaning story, we have to tell what took place. So, obviously, Andre winning the title, 15.2 rating, Saturday night's main event, biggest TV audience for a professional wrestling show ever. 33 million people. 33 million people. Now, they did tell an interesting story here with this by saying that Andre winning the title was leaked online, or not leaked online, but leaked in the dirt sheets before it happened. So there's a theory that perhaps people were told so that it could leak out and it would drum up interest. Now, the leak apparently came from the TV production people being involved with the show. That because they wanted to make this the biggest episode it could possibly be, they brought in more television people. And more TV people means more people listening in on the plans, more people knowing what's going on, and that it was basically told that, more people knew that Andre was going to win the title. And these people went out and leaked it to the dirt sheets, and then the dirt sheets found out, told other people. But I don't see that many more people tuning in because I don't think that many more people knew. Even if it was in the dirt sheets still represent a small number of people. This got a 15.2, 33 million people watched this. I doubt you can say that the dirt sheets leaking or somebody leaking the results changed it that much. I don't see that. After this led through WrestleMania 4, which of course was the tournament where Andre was eliminated and Macho Man wins the title. We get more Andre being a backstage bully as he bullies Bam Bam Bigelow out of the business or out of the WWF because Bam Bam Bigelow was said to be sort of a loudmouth, a bit of a cocky guy, and he was doing a little too much. So Andre beat him up in the ring, made life very difficult for him, and he ended up quitting. And ended up saying later on that it might have been his own fault for bringing too much attention and was trying to do too much and really kind of being a young guy and not really appreciating the spot that he was in. And Andre being a little bit older. Randy Savage, the world champion at the time, has gotten a little too big for his britches as well. Andre doesn't like working with him. Randy Savage wears too much baby oil and he's told Randy to stop wearing so much baby oil. But Randy's like, I gotta take care of my look, brother. You know, you're a giant. I ain't a giant. I gotta make sure I look good. But Andre didn't like all of that baby oil because it was very difficult to get off. So he would beat up our favorite wrestler Randy Savage because it was very difficult to get all the baby oil off of him. So Andre works his last major main event at SummerSlam 1988 when it was Andre and Ted DiBiase versus the Mega Powers. It got 400,000 buys. The Hogan Andre built Survivor Series SummerSlam and headlined 2 WrestleManias. So their feud is literally the bedrock of modern WWF. So Andre finished the year tied number 3 in top draws in wrestling. Hogan and Savage were 1 and 2. Andre was 42 years old and was making between $2 and $5 million on his last real run. 1989, we start to see Andre as his run is nearing its end. He's feuding with the Ultimate Warrior on house shows, doing very, very quick jobs. He's doing jobs in 30 seconds or so. So the Ultimate Warrior ultimately holds the most pinfall victories over Andre the Giant, as he worked with Andre essentially everywhere and beating him in 30 to 40 seconds. These matches were not allowed to be recorded whatsoever in order to protect Andre. The mythology. It's all about the mythology. So they wanted to put Warrior over, make him look good to that audience, but not beyond that audience. So this becomes a big issue on August the 21st, 1989, as Andre attacks a cameraman, a guy named Ben Hildenbrandt. He was told not to film Andre versus Ultimate Warrior at a house show. He was told not to film this. He asked if he could film the entrances, and he was told yes, he could film the entrances. He filmed the entrances. He had been filming things all night. So he filmed the entrances and then turned his camera off. Andre, after the match, saw him and came after him for his camera and hit him in the head by mistake and knocked him down and, got his camera snatched from him and everything. Andre was arrested for simple assault and third-degree criminal mischief. The promoters were upset that Ben Hildenbrandt actually pressed charges. And Ben said that he was a young guy who was pressured by the police into filing charges, and so he did. Andre never spent any time in jail. He actually left town the next morning. And the WWF was actually able to prove that Ben Hildenbrandt had not actually recorded that match. He never took any pictures beyond the entrances. So he really didn't do anything wrong. He really didn't do anything. And Andre was kind of just overreacting and overprotecting himself. In any event, in 1990, Ben Hildenbrandt filed a lawsuit against the WWF and Andre the Giant. Andre was found guilty of criminal mischief, but acquitted of assault because he did not mean to harm the guy. He was trying to grab the camera, and the guy kind of tried to protect the camera. That's kind of how he put himself in danger. Ben got a small settlement, and we can't know how much because he signed a non-disclosure. But that was sort of part of Andre's downfall. And Andre wrestling Warrior on TV, when they wrestled on TV, they wrestled in longer matches, and Andre was protected more. Mostly these would end in disqualifications. But it was clear that despite the fact that they had been working all over the place, they had no chemistry, and Andre did not like working with Warrior because Warrior was very stiff. The stories that Bobby Heenan told on the self-destruction of the Ultimate Warrior about Warrior throwing really heavy clotheslines and really unnecessary heavy punches on Andre is essentially where we get most of the information. Because he's told that story in other places. It's not like he told it just in that DVD and that was it. He's told that story all the time. And of course, I'm pretty sure other people have backed it up that Warrior was too rough with Andre and Andre didn't like him. And, that sort of thing is, shows that they really didn't have much chemistry, but Vince was going to shove the Ultimate Warrior to the top of the card come hell or high water. So October 28th, 1990, Andre wrestles the Ultimate Warrior in Madison Square Garden. Andre loses in 30 seconds. This match was televised on the Madison Square Garden network. Interestingly enough, This was the last match Andre had headlining Madison Square Garden, was losing to Ultimate Warrior in 30 seconds. Andre finished 8th in the biggest draw of 1989. He would never make that list again. On October the 20th, 1989, Andre had his final match in Montreal against Warrior and drew 7,000 fans, and he lost by disqualification. It was, of course, not promoted as his last match. He won the tag team belts with Haku in 1989. They did work the loop with Demolition as the Colossal Connection. The Demolition eliminated Andre from the Royal Rumble, which was the last match or the last Royal Rumble that would feature him. He worked against Demolition in WrestleMania 6, but he never actually tagged in. Then they did the miscommunication where Andre was kicked by Haku, and then Bobby the Brain Heenan blamed Andre for the team losing. Of course, this turn leads to Andre's babyface turn. And so the 80s ends with Andre kind of on the downslope. He's not nearly the force he was in the 70s or in the early to mid 80s. He's gaining some weight. He's slower than he used to be. He's virtually immobile at this point. But he's still Andre the goddamn Giant, and he can make some money. So we got to talk about Andre in the 1990s, which is kind of the last 3 years of his life. Andre worked babyface for the first time in Japan on April the 13th, 1990. All Japan, New Japan, and WWF had worked together for what's called the Wrestling Summit in Tokyo. They drew 53,743 fans. The match was Andre the Giant and Giant Baba versus Demolition. And Giant Baba and Andre won in 6 minutes. Baba was 52 years old. Andre was 44. Both of them were old and virtually immobile. Very interesting. Around this time, Andre becomes very resentful of Vince McMahon. He is not being featured like he wants to, so he goes and does an appearance for Herb Abrams at the Universal Wrestling Federation on October the 11th and November the 11th. Abrams had hired quite a few of Andre's friends, and this was said to be a ploy by Andre in order to get attention, that he wanted Vince to sign him to another contract. And the Herb Abrams thing actually worked. You know, after Vince saw him pop up for Herb Abrams, he decided to give him some cash and send him back out on the road. So Andre was used as an attraction, usually as a babyface enforcer. He just hung out in the ring, outside the ring, and waved to the crowds and be a pretty good ambassador. He started making all types of appearances. He appeared at SummerSlam 1991, which was his final appearance in North America. And his final match was May 10th, 1991. It was a Battle Royal on Long Island. Then Andre was sent to Europe to make appearances in England, Spain, and Belgium. And this was sort of the end of his WWF run. So he had been under contract to the McMahons for a long time at this point. And now in 1991, Andre finds himself, just floating out there in the independents, I guess you could say. And he's trying to do his own thing. He's still Andre the Giant. So Andre worked 6-man tags in Japan and tended to his ranch most of the time. He toured Mexico, which he had been touring in Mexico since the 80s and the 70s. This is where they tell a very embarrassing story of Andre's bowels loosening all over Bad News Island, where he tried to do a squash. He's just sitting on him. And when he sat down, his bowels released, and he literally shit all over Bad News Island. And they said that Andre had been drinking mezcal and clamato juice, and which had given him diarrhea. So when he did the splash, it sort of all just came out. And Bam Bam Bigelow, I believe, told this story, and Bad News Island sort of confirmed it, that Andre shit all over him. So Bad News Island just had such terrible stories of Andre the Giant, for fuck's sake. He shit all over me. This time, as well as Tim White is still traveling with Andre, even though he's not under contract to the WWF anymore. At least he's not doing televised things. And Tim White is now pushing Andre around in a wheelchair, so Andre wouldn't have to walk. This would relieve the pain in his knees to help him out. So Andre makes his last television appearance on September the 2nd for WCW. He shows up at Clash of the Champions. He was interviewed with, or he was seen on camera on crutches, but he didn't speak. He never said anything, but he appeared on WCW television. And Vince McMahon actually called him on the phone and told him that this act had hurt his feelings. And Andre was pretty upset that he had kind of upset Vince by making an appearance for WCW. But, he didn't see it as being that big of a deal because he didn't do anything and he didn't say anything. But just lending his presence to WCW was more than enough to sort of upset Vince. But Andre was in that particular point in time where he was traveling mostly to see his friends. And that's what the WCW thing was all about. He was just going to hang out with some friends and kind of got roped into being on Clash of the Champions. And Vince kind of got upset with him, but he refused to retire. Andre wanted to travel and hang out with his friends. That was his whole career, had been traveling, being the Giant, meeting people, hanging out with his friends, playing cards. That was his life at that point. And he figured he would die of boredom and there's literally nothing for him to do. And so he kept traveling as much as he could. He wanted to stay active. He was only 44 or 45 years old at the time. What do you expect the guy to do? He still has theoretically a lot of life left. But Andre the Giant, of course, is not a normal person. So Andre the Giant's father was 85 years old when he passed. Andre was already in France when his father passed away and decided to stay for the funeral. On January the 28th at 6:20 p.m. 1993, Andre the Giant passed away. The WWF was the first promotion that announced his death, and they did a 10-bell salute on January the 29th at the Madison Square Garden show. Andre wanted his body to be cremated, but his body was too big for any of the French crematoriums. He had to be cremated in North Carolina. They tell, of course, that his body was too big for a hearse. So a cargo plane was going to be needed to carry his body. They tell this grisly story of his mom having to make the decision whether to carve his body up so that he could be cremated in France. And she refused to carve his body up. That is absolutely awful that you would bring that to somebody. His mom was still alive. And to bring that plan, like, hey, we could cremate him. It'd have to be in sections, but we could cremate him. You have to tell this woman you have to carve her son's corpse up. Come on, man. What the fuck? Why would you even I get that you kind of have to say, look, and we want to help you out. This is the best we can do. But to even mention carving up somebody's son's body, come on. Anyway, February 24th was Andre's funeral. Andre's funeral was a week after Kerry Von Erich had committed suicide on February the 18th, and 2 weeks before Dino Bravo was murdered on March the 10th. So for this 7-week period, you saw a lot of wrestling death. That is terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. Pat Laprade and Bertrand Hebert, they've been telling this story of Andre the mythology and Andre the man. And the mythology of Andre is immortal and it's larger than life. He's 7'4", 500 pounds, unbeaten, undefeated, unslammed. None of that stuff was true, but that was the mythology. And they talk about how thick the mythology had hung over the life of the actual man, Andrei Roussimoff. And nothing typifies that more than the following statements that I learned in this book. And that Andre's real name does not even appear in his funeral. He's called Andre the Giant at his funeral. Nobody referred to him as by his real name. That is scary. That's scary. So, his will, after he died, he left Jackie and Frenchie, who of course tended to his farm, his best friends. He left them a bulk of his earnings, all the money he had already earned. He left to them, and he also left the ranch to them. The rest went to Robin, his daughter, who was 13 at the time, but she could only access the money when she turned 30, which would have been in 2009. Andre wanted it to be when she turned 40. He wanted to keep the money away till she turned 40 years old, because it was all about his beef with Jean. He did not want Jean to have access to any of his money. So he wanted to make sure she was good and out of the way until Robin had gotten anything. But some people had gotten to him and talked to him and said, look, that's a little too long, man. Like chill out. So 30, so Robin didn't get any money from being Andre the Giant's daughter until 2009 when she turned 30 years old. That's absolutely frightening. Andre left his parents, his surviving parent, which was his mom, and his family absolutely nothing. And there was no reason why. There was no reason given. He didn't leave any of his inheritance, any of his land, anything to his mother. He left it all to his friends who were living with him on the ranch, and to his daughter. Very, very odd man, this Andre the Giant. And there was no history of him and his family having fallen out or anything like that either. I mean, he was staying there when he died. But, at least he made sure his daughter was taken care of to some degree. I don't see how he could have known that his daughter was going to live to be 30. I mean, especially since some people don't live to be that long. But he didn't want Jean getting the money, so I understand that. But I wouldn't have put it that far away. 30? Man. He would have had to have been dead almost 20 years by the time she got her first penny of inheritance. That's frightening. So we see this throughout this story, the mythology of Andre the Giant, and we see the real man, Andre the Giant, or Andre Rusimov. And the man wasn't perfect. He made a lot of mistakes. He was, very human inside that body. And I really enjoy reading all the stories and all the different things that took place here. And while I'm a mythology guy, I don't care how much of kayfabe things. I don't go out of my way to know what a wrestler looks like under his mask or know what his real name is. All of that is not really relevant to me. That's kind of how I started my channel on that. I don't care what Mil Mascaras looks like. I'm not interested in Mil Mascaras the man. That's why I very, very, very rarely read wrestling biographies. I do love, however, histories of territories and stuff like that. So all of that stuff is fun. But this was a biography of somebody that I truly think is interesting because of how much mythology is surrounded by Andre the Giant. And nobody else has that much mythology around them. Andre died before he could be exposed as a racist, a lunatic, or something like that, or a wife beater or something crazy. Look what they did to Roddy Piper and Randy Savage and Shawn Michaels and Hulk Hogan and Ultimate Warrior. They continuously destroy these guys. Andre was the one guy no one had ever really talked shit about. He was the one mythology that was always protected, especially by WWE, because he, as a person and character, you don't really know that much about Andre. It was mostly Andre is a giant French guy, and that was pretty much his gimmick. So when you learn so much about Andre, it is tremendous, and you learn the ups and the downs of his life. Every documentary made creates new mythology. It's a new wing on that tree. And Pat Laprade and Bertrand Hebert are chasing down every single leaf off these trees and trying to correct. They watched all the documentaries and they're correcting different things from these documentaries. They're correcting articles that came out. They're correcting movies that were made on Andre the Giant. They're doing all kind of stuff, and it's the Lord's work in terms of not exposing Andre, but revealing the man. And there's a different thing. When you're trying to expose somebody, usually you're trying to embarrass them. You're trying to rip the curtain back and show that the emperor doesn't have any clothes. This is what people constantly do to Ultimate Warrior and Hulk Hogan. And this is the dark side of the ring. It's an expose. I'm trying to embarrass you. I'm trying to tear you down. In this instance, they're like, no, they went through to great lengths to protect Andre. Not in this book, but they're talking about how all the promoters, they wanted to have their guy beat Andre. They just want to beat the Giant. He's It took for some smart people to come in and say, look, man, this guy could be an attraction if we book him right. And then they do, and then he does, because he's got a natural charisma on top of his size. But everybody, he's, kind of naive when he starts in the business, and he's letting people slam him, and he's not really thinking how that looks to the average person. And then he's taught, this is how the average person can see you. This is how you can make more money in this business. This is how you can protect yourself. So you learn that he started out really naive and being taken advantage of. And to some degree, he starts getting a little, touchy over those sorts of things later in the later years. As he gets older and he can do less, you can see that he's learning. You can see that he's learning when it comes to, drugs and alcohol, learning more about his body. His body aches, so he started drinking and eating too much. It's not because he's a giant. It's because he's depressed. So his body, is hurting and he don't know what else to do. So he's drinking. That drinking is medication as far as he's concerned. This was a great book on a wrestling hero that in some ways both revealed the man, but also added new dimensions to the mythology of Andre the Giant. As we learned more about him, you could actually learn to respect him a little bit more. And that's really what a good revealing does. Very different from an expose. I love this book. Know what you guys think in the comment section below. Like this video, share this video, subscribe to the channel, donate to the channel. Thank you guys for your time, and I will talk to you guys later, man. Peace out.